Hello and welcome to our Bible study series here in Haverhill and Withersfield for May 2026. We have just finished looking at the Gospel of Matthew through Lent, Holy Week and Easter, and this time we are moving on to look at something slightly different, a selection of biblical texts which help us to reflect on the Messiah, Jesus as the Messiah. We do so by looking at the work of the composer Handel, Handel's Messiah, which is an oratorio, a musical work which brings together different biblical texts which paint a picture of the coming of the Messiah. And I hope will help us to understand what we mean when we talk about Jesus the Messiah, Jesus Christ, Jesus the Anointed One. Because that's a concept that we use in our religious practice and theological thought quite a lot. It turns up in our scriptural reading quite a lot, but is one which we would do well to think carefully about. I've tried to do thematic Bible studies before, and I hope this is an interesting way for you of doing that sort of study. We're not moving away from the Bible, far from it. These are all biblical texts, but by taking different texts from different parts of the Bible, I hope that we're able to reflect on this very important central concept in terms of our understanding of who Jesus was and is, and what that means for us. So I hope if you are able to get hold of a copy of the Messiah, at least the text of the Messiah. You don't necessarily need to look at the music. I will be referring to the music sometimes, but really what I'm using this for is as a way of gathering the text together. So we've got copies of the text, what we call the libretto of the Messiah, available in church, or you can find that online. But do listen to recordings of the Messiah as well, because that hopefully will help to give you an understanding of the ways in which Handel and his librettist, Charles Jennens, helped to put that together. I am using slightly strange words like oratorio and libretto because that's how we describe this kind of music. Handel composed the Messiah in the middle of the 18th century as a response to the declining interest in Italian language and German language operas, and so he started composing works which were more accessible to an English-speaking audience. He had patrons in London and in Dublin, in Ireland, and in fact, the Messiah received its first performance in Dublin in 1742, and then a year later in London. Handel, therefore, because his patrons tended to be religious or religiously interested, his oratorios tended to reflect on a religious theme. And so he was bringing together the church, his religious life, his faith, as well as the arts and that public way of presenting material to a wider audience. And so that's why I think it's worth studying the Messiah as part of our Bible study series, because the arts, whether that's through painting or the creative arts or through music or through drama, however it is, the arts help us to access our theology, our faith, as well as our scriptural reading in different ways. So even if music isn't perhaps something that you are most comfortable with, I hope you appreciate this as a different way of accessing Bible study just for this month of May. Indeed, the librettist Jennens signalled that in his preface to that first edition, when he chose some words, firstly from 1 Timothy 3 and from Colossians 2, to describe how he wanted this work to be seen. He said, God was manifested in the flesh, justified by the Spirit, seen of angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up in glory, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Uh, he saw this very much as a presentation of wisdom and knowledge in a way that was more accessible to a different audience. But he also chose some words not from a religious text at all, but from Virgil's Eclogue 4. He said, Maiora canamus, let us sing of greater things. Uh, Again, signalling that this was a work in which everybody should be able to take an interest. And therefore, this was an evangelizing work in one sense, that perhaps through performing or listening to or watching this work, this oratorio, even those who might claim that they didn't have a faith or didn't believe in what it taught might come to understand something of the importance of Jesus as the Messiah for us. So the oratorio opens with an overture, setting the scene of how musically we are to be welcomed into this piece. And as you listen to that, it almost sort of doesn't give the game away as to how we're supposed to be feeling or responding to this invitation to reflect on Jesus as the Messiah. And that's quite deliberate. When we think of summarizing these great themes of the Bible, very often we start with the sinfulness or the suffering of humanity. And therefore we paint a picture of despair before we get to more hopeful themes. But actually, what the Messiah does is jump straight in to this message of comfort, which I think is meant to be an invitation to recognize that the Messiah was one who would um, be alongside us in our earthly life, whether or not that was a life of suffering or sinfulness, or whether that was a life of joy and celebration, because the Messiah was one whom we ought to see as accompanying us in all those things. Now, the Messiah was presented in Hebrew thought as somebody, a human being, a real person who would come to bring salvation. We've already seen in Matthew's Gospel how militaristic language has been used. And when we say salvation, we are talking about military victory, deliverance from oppressors, that sort of freedom to live in a very earthly sense. And um, that's perhaps originally how the Messiah was to be seen. Messiah just means anointed one in Hebrew, and any king would be anointed. So the Messiah was a position of leadership, a position of authority, a position of salvation, a position of bringing victory and goodness, but also a position of, as I said, living this life alongside the people. And if you look through the Hebrew chronicles of the kings, the best kings are described as those who lived as one of their people and lived alongside their people. And I think that was true in the conception of the Messiah too. So when the first words of Handel's oratorio of the Messiah are comfort ye my people, from Isaiah 40. I think that's an important message, that the scene has been set not by any imposition of an understanding of the human condition, but actually we're allowed to come to this with our own uh, circumstances and expectations of what it means to be human, and therefore for Jesus the Messiah to share that humanity, not a generalized concept of humanity, but actually our humanity, my humanity, Max's humanity, as well as yours. To jump straight in with this message, comfort ye, it comes from Isaiah 40, and the book of Isaiah is often thought to have been written in two halves. And so this message, comfort ye, that those are the first words of the second half of the book of Isaiah. So although we're plucking words from the middle of Isaiah as we've received it, those are actually the first words of the second half of the book of Isaiah. And it's that message from Isaiah from which many of our prophecies about the Messiah are drawn. And throughout Advent and Christmas in particular, we hear many reflections from the prophet Isaiah, as well as during Lent and Holy Week too. Uh, Isaiah very much saw the Messiah as a human being, and in fact, there are ways in which even the prophet Isaiah applies this concept of the Anointed One, the salvation bringer, to King Cyrus, a historical figure in Isaiah's time, who could have been said to bring some practical, real deliverance to the Hebrew people, conquering their Babylonian captors and allowing them to return to their holy city of Jerusalem. Um, we don't get those reflections in Handel's oratorio. He very much wants to lead us into an understanding that Jesus is the Messiah. But there are ways in which others help us to build up that picture of what we expect from the Messiah too. So Handel uses these words from Isaiah 40, comfort ye, my people, saith your God. So there's a relationship here already, that the Messiah will be sent from God, but there's a relationship between our God and his people. We're a possession of his. We are therefore to be cared for and looked after and provided for and safeguarded by our God. And so when we're talking about the salvation that the Messiah brings, those expectations are already set up in that relationship between us, we who are God's people, and God who is our God. There's an expectation too that this salvation, this coming of the Messiah, should raise our expectations, should raise our mood, and that's a very physical lifting up. That's how it's described. And so in the third movement, Handel uses words also from Isaiah 40. Every valley shall be exalted, lifted up, uh, in a very practical way, but also the mountains made low. There's a sort of a leveling of our our experience of God. When we're thinking about how we experience mental health, actually, that's a very important reflection. That when we're talking about stability and mental health, it's both the highs and the lows that we need to treat, because excessive highs of mood and experience can be just as traumatic as excessive lows. And so we shouldn't think of this as necessarily a temperance or moderation in a critical sense, but actually stability is an important means of religious understanding and experience, so that we can move forward, so that we can be creative and expressive um, in safe and peaceful ways. So this expectation of the Messiah as a stabilizer might also be a helpful one drawn from the prophecies of Isaiah. Again, not to temper our experience of excitement and joy, quite the opposite. And the music helps us to do that, because the music should excite us and allow us to recognise that delight is found in a certain safety and stability of our experience. All of those movements have been solo movements, or both of those movements have been solo movements. The first chorus, we're still moving through Isaiah 40, is, "And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed." Revealed, uncovered. We're being drawn into an experience which is already there. So the Messiah isn't some thing or someone that comes from outside and is imposed upon us, but we'll see how the Messiah is someone who is grown from our very flesh, from our very experience. That's why it will be important that Jesus is born of our flesh, has a mother, Mary, who will conceive and bear him. And all flesh shall see it together. There's a communal aspect to this. So yes, this is my Messiah and your Messiah, but it's our Messiah too. And our communal understanding of what this means for us is important. The Messiah shall be revealed to us, uncovered, discovered, as a showing of the glory of the Lord, which has been there all along, just waiting to spring out, to show itself, and to help us understand it. And Handel will draw us on into texts specifically about the conception and birth of Jesus. But first, in the fifth movement, he takes us away from the prophet Isaiah into the prophets Haggai and Malachi, Haggai 2 and Malachi 3. Having taken us in the first four movements through texts from a very specific part of Isaiah 40, I think it's important at this point that he then widens the scope of prophecy to say this is not just Isaiah. We've talked about the importance of community in our understanding of who the Messiah is. So there are other voices who lend themselves to prophesying the coming of this Messiah too, Haggai and Malachi. Thus says the Lord of hosts, yet once a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land, and the nations shall come. The Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple. Again, others who reflect on this understanding of the Messiah in relationship with us as a community. But Malachi goes on to say, who may abide the day of his coming? This will be a good thing. This will bring joy and excitement and expectation. But there's a way in which Handel is also setting us up to recognize that we will have some duty to respond to that coming of the Messiah appropriately, who may abide. So our calling in response to the coming of the Messiah, the stabilizer, the safeguarder, is actually to abide, to be a place, a resting place, a point of homing, indwelling, where that stability and safeguarding may take root. And it's Malachi's prophecy, Malachi 3, that invites that reflection. Again, we're not supposed to see this stabilizing as taking anything away from us, but actually giving us a deeply rootedness in God's eternal relationship with us. For the chorus go on to sing, he shall purify the sons of Levi. That purification, cleansing, which we'll see is done by the power of the Holy Spirit, um, again is not to detract, but actually is to make us a safe, a pure, a holy space, which should be an exciting thing. And I think Handel does make it so in his music. It's those texts then that set Handel up to bring in this concept of actually the Messiah will need to be then somebody who understands our humanity to the point of sharing our very flesh with us. Having built up concepts of stability and purity, that allows Handel to draw on Isaiah's text to say that, behold, a virgin shall conceive, and he shall call his name Emmanuel, which Matthew translates as God with us. And the way in which Handel sets those words, he brings Isaiah and Matthew together to emphasize those words. Emmanuel, God with us. There's a coda, there's a musical emphasis on those words, God with us. And perhaps that in this first act, this first part of the oratorio, is one of the principal things we should take away from who the Messiah is. The Messiah is simply God with us. And that is something that is good news, good tidings, that we should tell about. And so we have, again, texts from Isaiah 40 and from Isaiah 60, in which Handel sets words, O thou that tellest good tidings to Zion, get thee up into the high mountains. This should be something that we want to celebrate, that we want to tell others about, that we want to rejoice in, that we want others to share in, because that helps to deepen that sense of Messiah in relationship with us as a community. Why? Because the antithesis to the coming of the Messiah is that darkness shall cover the earth. Um, Isaiah 60, and gross darkness the people. But the Lord shall arise upon thee, and his glory shall be seen upon thee. This is a moment of uncovering, of revealing, of joy and enlightenment for the people, for everybody, the nations. Gentiles shall come to thy light, kings to the brightness of thy rising. This is an attractive invitation, proclamation. So again, we're already challenging those ideas that if the Messiah is a king-like person, and there are ways in which that is still true, but a king's salvation tends to be looking in. A king has his people as God has us, but that is often set against others. So there's a challenge here to that actually the Messiah's vindication and salvation is such an attractive one that it will bring others to become his people. So not in a sense, a traditional sense, that kings would subdue and conquer um, rival peoples, but that the king, the Messiah, should invite others to share in this kingdom. That's a very different way of approaching kingdom building to what is perhaps traditional, and perhaps to what we see in many parts of the world today, when we see um, communities like Russia and China aggressively trying to exert their influence and power and control over nations whom they wish to subjugate. For the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. For unto us a child is born. That's from Isaiah 9, but it's set against Isaiah 60. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined, is where movement 11 finishes. For unto us a child is born. You see how selecting different parts of the Bible, different scriptural texts, and bringing them together can help to make these wonderful connections, because we've got this reflection on the shadow of death being countered by the knowledge that a child is born to us. So the Messiah is not only a stabilizer, a safeguarder, a light bringer, but also a life giver. And many other things too, because in one of the more famous movements of the Messiah, the government shall be upon his shoulder. This is still kingdom building, but in a different way. And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Note, Wonderful and Counselor are two different titles. It's not Wonderful Counselor, and that's very clear in the word setting that Handel gives us. Wonderful Counselor. Unto us a child is born, and this child is going to take on those titles, those names, those attributes. And to therefore create this kingdom in which we can live under somebody who is this one who will be able to bring comfort, Counselor, who will be able to bring wonder, Wonderful, who will be able to bring stability, Mighty God, who will be able to bring peace, the Prince of Peace. And that's so we're already seeing this means of building a new kingdom. That message, there's a short musical interlude in movement 13, and then in movement 14, Handel takes us on from that prophecy that a child is born to the announcement from the angels that the Lord, the glory of the Lord has shone around us. So we don't quite get a narrative of the incarnation. We get the announcement of the prevailing glory of the Lord, and in movement 18, verses from Zechariah, which tell us that this should encourage us to rejoice greatly. And I think we'll see in later reflections in Acts 2 and 3 how Handel wants us to see the Messiah as one who suffers and redeems us, rising to new life. He's building up to a reflection on the crucifixion and resurrection. And doesn't skip over the incarnation, but very much sees it as a revelation of the glory of God, which prepares us for our experience of the suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ. And that's exactly what we've seen in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew, where we picked up with the Transfiguration as a reflection of the glory of God, which allows us to recognize that glory in very different ways through the ways in which that glory is mistreated and abused for our sake and for the greater knowledge of the complete and perfect eternal salvation of God. So Handel talks about the incarnation in that way too, as the coming of a child, as the birth of one who will inhabit these particular roles and callings, but as the revelation of the glory of God and this opportunity to rejoice in the knowledge of that coming. Then shall the eyes of the blind be opened, movement 19, verses from Isaiah 35, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing. If the Messiah is one who is sharing this earthly life as a means of comfort, and the word in English, comfort, just means giving strength by being with. The prefix com just means with, and fort is the same as the root of fortitude, strength. So comfort just means strength with. The Messiah is someone who shares this earthly life, therefore needs to be human. And Handel uses text from Isaiah and Matthew in particular to say perfectly human. Well, that means here in movement 19, we should see some strength coming from that and a very physical response to that. The eyes of the blind opened and so on. Ultimately, that can be summarized. For his yoke, the Messiah's yoke, is easy. His burden is light. Famous verses from Matthew 11, which finishes this first act and very neatly brings us back to that note of comfort, which began with the opening words of the second half of the book of Isaiah, "Comfort ye my people," and finishes, "His yoke is easy and his burden is light." The first act of Handel's oratorio, The Messiah, book-ended by notes of comfort as a way of introducing us into the idea that the Messiah will suffer with and for us and rise again for and with us. I hope that's been a helpful introduction into our thinking about Jesus as the Messiah, using the text of Handel's musical oratorio, The Messiah, to bring new insight and to bring different scriptural passages together in order to do that. There are two more acts of the Messiah, and therefore 2 more weeks of reflections before we gather at the end of the month. Thank you for joining us with this slightly different way of approaching Bible study. I hope you've appreciated it. Please do respond in the comments or to me personally and to one another, because it is in community that we understand and receive this knowledge of the Messiah's living with and for us. Thank you. Take care.